So thank you for your question. I think I'm not really sure that it's fair to say that international law has been slow to regulate these issues. I think it should be clear that climate change and biodiversity and soil degradation, these are incredibly complex issues. And maybe as a starting point for what law does, often law is invisible when it works. So you only see what law is not doing when things are not being regulated, or they are being regulated but not completely, or the regulation sort of lagging behind the reality or the facts. Another issue is that we can't look at climate change and biodiversity and soil degradation as we can't regulate this in one simple international legal treaty. So many things are being done. There are a lot of international legal treaties on climate change, on biodiversity, on soil degradation, on a whole range of environmental issues. But the reality is it takes time, and it's not only about international law or about having agreements, it's also about political will. And I think there's also, even though there is clearly consensus that these are issues, urgent issues that need to be dealt with, it's not necessarily clear how to deal with these issues, and there are many contradictory things to be done. So it's not a very straightforward path. And then the question about how international law can contribute to these issues, I think there are a number of ways. One is the more traditional approach to international law. You have international agreements that states they agree to be bound by certain rules. For example, in reducing carbon emissions, or in funding initiatives for adapting to already inevitable impacts on biodiversity loss or climate change. So the more traditional states come up with agreements. They agree to be bound by those. So that's one way in which international law, sort of in the most traditional sense, contributes. But I think international law does a whole lot more than that. So it also creates platforms for negotiating these issues, and it brings in a lot more actors than just states, and sort of contributes to narratives of how we think about these problems and how we might contribute to solving them. So those are, I think, two ways that international law contributes. So this question, I think, very much depends on how we interpret, on the one hand, feeding the world. So what does that mean? What do we need to do? We feed the world. And on the other hand, what does preserving the climate mean? So it's not very evident. I think these are very complex. Like feeding the world, it seems like it's very straightforward, but again, it's not so straightforward. How do you do that? And then preserving the climate, again, I think there's consensus that yes, we need to preserve the climate, but how do we preserve the climate, and at what, with what cost, and how do you weigh these different costs and benefits? So that's, I guess, my starting disclaimer. So assuming that, and this is, a valid assumption, climate has an impact on food production. Not only climate change, but climate in general. So the climate impacts what kind of food we can produce, how much food we can produce, where we can produce what food. So certainly climate change has an impact, and climate has an impact on feeding the world. So taking that sort of starting assumption, a sort of simple response, I think, would be things like reducing reducing meat consumption, consuming more locally, reducing food waste. These are not things, obviously, that I came up with. There can be quite a lot of agreement on those things, but how to go about actually achieving those. So I think if you want to reconcile sort of feeding the world and preserving the climate, those are the kinds of things to start with. But then I do want to go back to the disclaimer that I made and say that feeding the world is a whole lot more than preserving the climate. So I don't see the problem of food insecurity and hunger as primarily a problem of availability of food. It's a political and economic problem. So even if we would come to a point where we would have, let's say, dealt with the problem of climate, or we have preserved the climate, which we're probably never going to get to that sort of end point. It's always an ongoing process. But even if we get there, it still doesn't mean that then automatically the world is being fed, because it's not only the physical climate that's an obstacle to feeding the world. It's much more than that. Yeah, it's a huge question, but it's an interesting question, and I think it's, again, I guess my starting sort of counter question would be what is meant by inverted. So if I would take, if I would just interpret what I would think is meant by inverted, if you would, the opposite of industrialization and productivism would be perhaps more local production, smaller scale production rather than large scale production, then I don't think that this trend should be inverted, which is not to say that I don't see issues with our current global food system, which is a lot of production, also a lot of waste, a lot of certain kind of production. But I think that it's not necessarily fair to, I guess, to be so binary in those two things. It's either we're going to have industrialization and large-scale production, or we're going to have, everybody sort of growing their own food in their backyards or on their roofs. I'm exaggerating, of course, but often these two are presented, as completely opposing. So I think, in my view, it's naive to think that we can feed the world without having large-scale production, without having industrial agriculture. I think the reality is that industrial agriculture has fed a lot of people in the past. And so I think that is part of our system. It doesn't mean that we that there's no need to change that. But inverting it is a little too much, I would say. So I don't have any illusions that we can or should want to go back to a time when all we had was small-scale production and people were subsistent in terms of agriculture, because a lot of people really do not want to go back to that time, and it wasn't sort of the ideal scenario that some people who've never experienced that might imagine it to be. There are plenty of people who are very happy that they have access to processed, packaged food, and they don't need to actually do that themselves anymore. So I think actually the response to how to maybe, rather than invert the food system or make small changes to the food system that might make a big difference, is the same kind of responses that I gave to the previous question as well, is as much as possible having local production, trying not to have food trying not to eat things that you don't need to eat in certain seasons, eating things that are local and seasonal. But there are limits to that, of course. I don't think we can go back to a time where you didn't have specialized agriculture and you didn't have trade in food, but there can be limits to that. And one thing that I think is incredibly important is food waste, which is often tackled as an issue, but somehow hasn't really entered the mainstream discussions on climate change and biodiversity and food. And so I think that's also a big issue that needs to be tackled.